There is a particular kind of darkness that exists just before dawn on a military airbase. It is not the darkness of absence, it is the darkness of waiting. Every light on the field is deliberate, positioned, purposeful, casting just enough visibility for the work being done and nothing more. The rest is black, the kind of black that makes sound carry differently, that makes the engines of a single aircraft running at the far end of the runway audible from half a mile away. This morning, there is one aircraft, a bomber, large enough to require a crew of 12, old enough to have seen other missions, other targets, other mornings exactly like this one, except that no morning has ever been exactly like this one. The aircraft sits at the end of the runway with its engines turning, fuel loaded, systems checked and rechecked and checked again. Ground crew move around it in the darkness with the specific efficiency of people who have been told that what they are preparing matters more than anything they have ever prepared before. They were not told why. Inside the cockpit, a man sits at the controls and stares at the horizon. He's not young, he's not old. He is precisely the age of a man who has spent enough years in the air to understand completely what aircraft can do, and enough years in command to understand completely what orders mean. His hands rest on the controls with a stillness that is not calm exactly. It is the stillness of a mind that has made its decision and is now simply waiting for the moment to execute it. He was selected for this mission personally, not because of his decorations, though he has them, not because of his combat record, though it is distinguished. He was selected because of something rarer and more specific than either, because the men above him in the chain of command had studied him, assessed him, run him through scenarios and evaluations and conversations designed to answer a single question. When the moment comes, the specific moment that this specific mission requires, will his hand hesitate? Their conclusion was no. He had trained for 8 months for what was about to happen. 8 months of flying specific routes at specific altitudes with specific payloads, of practicing the exact maneuver the mission required, of living inside the operational details of a plan so classified that most of the men on his own crew did not know the full nature of what they were carrying. 8 months of preparation for a mission that would last approximately 12 hours from wheels up to wheels down, and approximately 43 seconds from release to irreversible. He knows what the weapon does. This is not an abstraction. He has been briefed in full, has sat in rooms where scientists explained, with the precision of people who built something and understand it completely, what happens when the weapon reaches its designated altitude above the target and detonates. The radius of total destruction, the secondary radius of severe damage, the tertiary effects that extend beyond both. He has seen the projections, the diagrams, the yield calculations expressed in units of measurement that did not exist before this weapon was built. He knows what the target is: a city, not a military installation, not a naval base or an arms factory or a strategic infrastructure target in the conventional sense. A city, with a civilian population numbered in the hundreds of thousands, waking up this morning, as cities do, with the ordinary momentum of people moving through the first hours of an ordinary day, unaware that in the airspace above them, an aircraft is climbing toward altitude with a single weapon in its bay. He has held these two pieces of knowledge, what the weapon does, what the target is, inside his mind for 8 months. And somewhere in those 8 months, in the private interior of a mind that was chosen precisely because it could hold this knowledge without breaking, a process occurred that we almost never talk about when we talk about military command. Not the decision to follow the order. That was never in question for him. He is a professional soldier. The order came through proper channels. The chain of command is intact. The authorization is legitimate. The decision to follow the order was made the moment he accepted the mission. What happened in those 8 months was something different. It was the construction of a framework, a psychological architecture built specifically to allow a human mind to carry the weight of an irreversible order without collapsing under it. before the order is even given. The framework that allows a man to sit in a cockpit in pre-dawn darkness, engines running, weapon loaded, target known, and be still. Not numb, not disconnected, not empty, still. The way a surgeon is still in the moment before the first incision. The way a judge is still in the moment before the verdict is read. The way anyone who has ever been given the weight of a decision that cannot be undone learns, or fails to learn, to carry that weight without letting it destroy the capacity to act. In less than 6 hours, the aircraft will be over the target. In less than 6 hours and 43 seconds, the order will be the kind that cannot be taken back. Right now, in the pre-dawn darkness, with the engines running and the ground crew finished and the runway ahead of him stretching into black, the man in the cockpit is in the last moment of before. The last moment in which the order is still only an order, in which the world is still the world it was yesterday, in which he is still, technically, the man he was before he did this. He has been asked, in the time since this mission passed into history, whether he felt anything in that cockpit, whether the weight of what he was carrying, not the weapon, the knowledge, pressed on him in those final minutes before takeoff. His answer was always the same. He said he thought about the mission, not what it meant, not what it would produce, not the city, not the people, not the 43 seconds, the mission, the route, the altitude, the sequence of actions required, the precise execution of a plan he had rehearsed until it lived in his hands as much as his mind. He had learned, had been trained, had trained himself to make the mission the entire contents of his attention, to fill every available space in his consciousness with the operational, the procedural, the executable, to leave no room for the other thing, the thing that lived underneath the mission and would still be there when the mission was over and the operational details had nothing left to occupy. The runway lights come on, the control tower clears him for takeoff. He advances the throttles, and the last moment of before ends. We have a story we tell ourselves about generals. It is a clean story, a useful story. A story that has been told so many times, in films, in history books, in the mythology of military leadership, that most people accept it without examination. The story goes like this. A general is a man of action, decisive, cold, certain, a mind so thoroughly trained for command that the weight of an order, the human cost of a decision, the irreversibility of what he sets in motion, does not slow him, cannot slow him. The machine of military command requires decisiveness, the way an engine requires fuel. Hesitation costs lives. Doubt is a luxury that the battlefield cannot afford, and so the general, by training and by temperament and by the specific selection process that placed him at the top of a chain of command, has eliminated those things, has become something closer to instrument than human, a mind that receives a strategic objective and produces an executable order with the clean efficiency of a process that has no room for the things that make decisions hard. This story is told because it is comforting, because if the men who give the orders that shape history are instruments rather than humans, if they operate in a register beyond ordinary psychological experience, then the orders they give exist in a different moral category than decisions made by ordinary minds. They are not choices in the way our choices are choices, they are outputs, inevitable products of training and strategy and the cold mathematics of war. This story is almost entirely false, and the falseness of it is not a minor detail. It is the most important thing to understand about military command at the highest level, because the truth of what actually happens inside the mind of a general facing an irreversible order is not cleaner than the story. It is not simpler. It is not more comfortable. It is vastly more psychologically complex. Here is what the research on military decision-making actually shows. Here is what the accounts of commanders who have faced the highest stakes orders in modern history actually reveal, when you strip away the mythology and read what they said in private, in letters, in diaries, in the testimony of people who were in the rooms. Generals feel everything. not despite their training, because of it. The same process that equips a military mind to function under extreme pressure, to maintain operational clarity when the stakes are highest, also equips it to understand, with extraordinary precision, exactly what an order costs. The training that produces decisiveness also produces a comprehensive map of consequences. And the higher the command, the more complete that map becomes. The more clearly the general can see not just the strategic objective, but the human reality of every decision made in its service. A lieutenant gives an order and sees the immediate tactical outcome. A general gives an order and sees everything downstream of it. Now understand what this means for the specific category of order we are talking about. Not all orders are equal. Military command involves thousands of decisions at every level: tactical, operational, strategic. Most of them exist within a framework of reversibility. An advance can become a retreat. A position can be abandoned. A strategy can be revised when new intelligence arrives. The architecture of military planning is built, in large part, around the management of uncertainty, around maintaining flexibility, preserving options, keeping the capacity to adjust when the situation changes. But there is a category of order that sits outside that framework entirely: the irreversible order. The order that, once given, produces consequences that cannot be stopped, cannot be recalled, cannot be walked back by any subsequent decision regardless of what that decision is. The order that crosses a threshold, strategic, moral, historical, that does not exist on the other side of the crossing. The order after which the world is permanently different from the world before it. Every commander who has ever faced this category of order has described the same experience, not in the same words, not in the same context, but with the same psychological signature. The weight arrives before the order is given, not during the execution, not after the consequences become visible, before, in the hours and days and sometimes months before the order is given, in the period when the decision is being considered, when the alternatives are being evaluated, when the mind of the commander is holding the full weight of what the order will produce and trying to find the framework that makes it bearable. This is the part that the clean story leaves out entirely, because the clean story needs the general to be certain, needs the order to flow from a mind that has processed the decision and arrived at resolution without the friction of doubt, of moral weight, of the specific psychological experience of knowing that what you are about to set in motion cannot be stopped once it begins. But certainty, at that level, in that category of decision, is not the starting point. It is the destination, and the journey to it, the internal process by which a mind moves from confronting an irreversible order to executing it, is one of the most psychologically demanding things a human being can do. Here is what that journey looks like. The first stage is comprehension. The commander must understand, completely and without protective distance, what the order will produce. Not abstractly, concretely. The strategic objective is clear. That is why the order is being considered. But the general who has earned his position does not stop at the strategic objective. He traces every downstream consequence he can see, the immediate human cost, the secondary effects, the tertiary implications, the historical precedents being set, the responses the order will generate that will themselves require orders in response. He builds the most complete picture of consequences he is capable of building, and then he holds that picture, not to find a reason not to give the order, to find the framework that justifies giving it, the calculus that makes the cost of the order smaller than the cost of not giving it, the moral architecture that allows a human mind to carry the weight of an irreversible decision and remain functional, remain capable of leading, of commanding, of doing the job that only he, in that position, at that moment, can do. This is what distinguishes the commanders who have given irreversible orders throughout history from the ones who could not. Not the absence of doubt, not the absence of moral weight, not the clean certainty of the story we tell ourselves, The ability to carry the weight without being crushed by it. The ability to hold the full picture of what the order costs, to look at it without protective distance, without the insulation of abstraction, and still find the line that justifies the crossing, and then to cross it. This is not coldness. It is something rarer and more demanding than coldness. It is the specific psychological capacity that sits at the intersection of moral clarity, strategic understanding, and the kind of courage that most people never have to locate in themselves, because most people are never asked to give the order that cannot be taken back. The man in the cockpit at the end of that runway had made that journey. 8 months of training, 8 months of living inside the operational details of the mission while, somewhere underneath, the moral framework was being constructed and tested and refined. 8 months of moving from comprehension to justification to resolution, to the specific psychological state that allows a hand to not hesitate. He arrived at the cockpit already through the hardest part. What came next was, in a certain sense, the easier thing, the execution. Because execution, for a mind like his, is the territory of training, of procedure, of the operational clarity that military preparation produces. The moral weight had been processed in the months before. The framework had been built, the calculus had been made. What remained was the mission. And the 43 seconds before the cockpit, there was a room, not one room, many rooms, spread across months of meetings, memoranda, classified discussions held in buildings whose locations were themselves classified, rooms where the people present signed documents acknowledging that what was discussed inside could not leave inside, that the weight of what was being decided would be carried privately, officially, without the relief of being able to tell anyone outside the circle what was being considered. But there was one room more than the others, one meeting, in one building, where the decision moved from theoretical to operational, where the question stopped being whether and became when, and where, and how, where the men around the table looked at each other across maps and casualty projections and intelligence assessments, and made the specific psychological transition that all irreversible decisions require, from considering the unthinkable to authorizing it. Understand who was in that room, not soldiers, not primarily. The men who carried the most weight in that room were civilians, politicians who had been elected to represent populations that did not know this decision was being made on their behalf. Scientists who had spent years building the weapon being discussed and now sat in the room where its use would be authorized, carrying a specific kind of moral complexity that nobody had prepared them for. Strategists and advisors whose job was to translate the abstract into the executable, to take the question of whether and convert it into a plan. And military commanders, senior officers who had spent careers learning to think in the specific register of military necessity, the register in which human cost is a variable in a calculation, not an endpoint in itself. Men who could look at casualty projections with a trained analytical distance that was not indifference, but was, to anyone watching from outside, almost indistinguishable from it. These men, this specific combination of politicians, scientists, strategists, and commanders, sat in that room and did something that human beings in positions of power have been doing since the first organized conflict in human history. They constructed a framework that made the decision feel necessary. This is the most important psychological process to understand about irreversible decisions at the highest level of power. Not the decision itself, the framework that precedes it. The specific mental architecture that transforms an action, that in other contexts, under other circumstances, by other names would be considered unthinkable, into something that feels not just permissible but required, the only responsible choice available to people who understand the full picture. Because here is the truth about rooms like this one. Nobody in that room thought of themselves as making a monstrous decision. Every person at that table, the politicians, the scientists, the strategists, the commanders, believed, at the level at which human beings have to believe things in order to act on them. that what they were authorizing was the lesser of available evils, that the alternative, the options on the other side of the decision, carried a human cost that was larger, not smaller, than what they were choosing, that the framework of military necessity, of strategic calculation, of the responsibility to end a war that had already consumed tens of millions of lives, that this framework justified the crossing of a threshold that had never been crossed before. This is how irreversible decisions are made in rooms like that one, not through the absence of moral consideration, through the construction of a moral framework large enough to contain the decision, a framework built from real information, from genuine casualty projections, from legitimate strategic analysis, from authentic assessments of the alternatives, but assembled in a specific way, weighted in a specific direction, because the people in the room had already, at some level below conscious articulation, moved from considering the decision to needing to justify it. Psychologists who study high-stakes group decision-making have a name for the process that operates in rooms like this. They call it motivated reasoning, not lying, not cynicism, not the conscious manipulation of evidence to reach a predetermined conclusion. Something more subtle and more universal than any of those things. The tendency of the human mind, especially under pressure, especially in groups, especially when the stakes are existential, to evaluate evidence in the direction of the conclusion it needs to reach, to weigh the arguments that support the decision more heavily than the arguments that complicate it, to find the framework that makes action feel more necessary than inaction. Every person in that room was capable of motivated reasoning. Every person in every room, where every major irreversible decision in history has been made, has been capable of it. It is not a character flaw. It is not a moral failing specific to these men in this moment. It is a feature of human cognition under conditions of extreme pressure and high stakes. And in that room, it operated at full intensity because the pressure was real, the war was real, the casualty projections were real, the intelligence about what a conventional invasion would cost, in lives, in time, in the continuation of a conflict that was already catastrophic was real. These were not fabricated justifications assembled after the fact. They were genuine inputs into a genuine calculation. But here is what the psychological research shows about motivated reasoning in group settings under existential pressure. The inputs were real. The weighting of those inputs was not neutral. The voices that argued most strongly for the use of the weapon were heard most fully. The voices that questioned, that introduced doubt, that complicated the framework, that raised the moral weight of what was being considered, were heard with a specific kind of resistance, not silenced, not dismissed, but processed through a filter that was already oriented toward action, already moving toward the decision, already constructing the framework that would make the irreversible feel necessary. There was dissent in that room. Not everyone who sat at that table or in the tables adjacent to it reached the same conclusion. Several of the most senior military minds involved in the broader decision expressed reservations, some privately, some in memoranda, that were filed and acknowledged and ultimately set aside. Men who had seen more war than most of the civilians at that table, who had a different relationship to the human cost of military action, who calculated the strategic necessity differently. Their dissent did not change the outcome, but it tells us something critical about the psychology of irreversible decisions. The dissent did not come from people who failed to understand the strategic picture. It came from people who weighted the inputs differently, who constructed a different framework from the same information, who looked at the same casualty projections, the same intelligence assessments, the same map of available options, and reached a different conclusion about what necessity actually required. This is the thing about irreversible decisions that rooms like that one are designed to obscure, who constructed a different framework from the same information, who looked at the same casualty projections, the same intelligence assessments, the same map of available options, and reached a different conclusion about what necessity actually required. This is the thing about irreversible decisions, that rooms like that one are designed to obscure a framework that was constructed by human beings under pressure, in a room, using motivated reasoning, and that produced an outcome that other human beings, using different weighting, different frameworks, different definitions of necessity, would not have produced. The decision felt inevitable to the people who made it. It was not inevitable. It was a choice made in a room by men who needed to believe, and succeeded in believing, that it was the only choice available to people who understood what they understood. And when that meeting ended, when the authorization was given, when the decision moved from the conference table to the operational planners, to the commanders, to the crews, to the runway, to the cockpit, the room emptied. The men who had been in it went back to their offices, their responsibilities, their other decisions. The framework they had built held the weight they had placed inside it. The motivated reasoning had done its work. And somewhere, in a hangar in the middle of a desert, a weapon was being loaded onto an aircraft by men who had not been in the room, who had not built the framework, who had simply received the order and would carry it out. History buries its dissenters in footnotes. Here is what the footnotes say. Some of the most decorated military minds involved in this decision, men who had commanded armies, who had seen more war than anyone sitting in that conference room, said no. Not quietly, not ambiguously. No, they had access to the same intelligence, the same casualty projections, the same strategic analysis, and they reached a completely different conclusion, not because they were naive about war. These men had ordered soldiers into situations where death was the expected outcome. They understood the cost of military decisions from the inside, not from a conference table. They said no from inside that experience, not despite it. Their argument was strategic, not moral. They looked at the same enemy, supply lines degraded, naval capacity destroyed, resources collapsing, and concluded that continued conventional pressure would achieve the same outcome, without crossing a threshold that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. That threshold was the point, because using this weapon wouldn't just end one war, it would tell every nation on Earth that this category of weapon was usable, not a deterrent, not a last resort, a weapon. That precedent, the dissenters argued, would cost more than the war it ended. They were thinking past the war. The men who authorized the order were thinking about ending it. Both calculations were rational. Both were made in good faith. They reached opposite conclusions because they were answering different questions, and the question you ask determines the answer you get. The dissenters lost the argument. The order traveled down the chain of command, past their objections, past the footnotes, past the rooms where the framework was built to a man who had not been in any of those rooms, who had not made any of those calculations, who had simply been selected because his hand would not hesitate. The moral weight of the decision did not travel with the order. Only the order traveled, clean, authorized, executable. The aircraft has been in the air for 6 hours. 6 hours of engines and instruments, and the specific operational focus the pilot had trained himself to maintain. The mission as the entire contents of attention, leaving no room for the thing underneath. For 6 hours, it had worked. Now the target is visible below, clear, not obscured. The morning has decided, through no agency of its own, to offer no obstruction. The bomb run begins. This is not a moment of decision. The decision was made in a conference room months ago. The bomb run is the end of the choosing. Pure procedure now, a sequence so thoroughly rehearsed it lives below conscious thought. In the hands, in the body, in muscle memory built over 8 months of training. This is what the training was for, not to make the pilot brave enough, to make the doing of it automatic enough that the thing underneath could not interrupt it. The bomb bay doors open. The release happens, not with drama. A mechanical release, a connection severing, a weight departing the aircraft. 11,000 pounds lighter, The aircraft wants to climb. His hands compensate before conscious thought does. He's already in the turn. 43 seconds. 30, 20, 10. He has been briefed on the flash, told it will be unlike anything in their experience of conventional weapons. What the briefing could not give him was the experience of it. The flash arrives, not a bright light that passes. Something that replaces the sky, occupying every part of the visual field simultaneously, for a fraction of a second that the optic nerve was not designed to process. Then the shockwave, not from below, not from behind. From everywhere at once, the aircraft bucks, drops. The structure makes sounds that airframes are not supposed to make. For 2 seconds, the possibility that the aircraft will not survive is real. Then it passes. The aircraft is intact. The pilot brings it back to level flight, his hands on the controls, his instruments reading, his aircraft flying. He turns to look back and sees a cloud. Not a cloud in any category his experience contains. A column rising from where the city was, rising with a speed that seems to contradict what columns of material can do in the physical world. He does not describe what was below the cloud. Not in the debriefing, not in the interviews, not in the decades of questions that follow him through the rest of his life. Because some things, once seen, do not become words. He knew the order was irreversible in the conference room, knew it on the runway, knew it in the 43 seconds. He knew it the way you know something when it exists as information. Now he knew it the way you know something when you have looked at it. These are not the same kind of knowing. The aircraft turns for home, the order is complete, and the pilot, for the first time in 8 months, has nothing left to do. Just the wait, and the cloud behind him, rising.